Welcome back to Secrets of New Genesis. I'm your host, PrinceBrightstar. So it's been about half a year since I released the last part of this series, and in that time, we've had the release of the Kvaris region, as well as the addition of mini-episodes. We've gotten a lot of information from that, and it's time to talk about it before the Stia region comes out. If this is your first time looking into this series, basically I take a look at Phantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis from a lore perspective and try to understand just how the world in the game makes sense and try to connect what I see with other plot points we've seen previously in the Phantasy Star series. Let's kick this one off in the Kvaris region. So I need to address this first today. While Sega didn't directly reference me, I have to wonder if this new NPC was added because of the second video of this series, which won an honorable mention in the open video contest. Keep in mind, when I theorize, I can only go off of what I see, and if I've gotten something wrong, the story is the only way to put us back on track with what they want us to know. Unfortunately, the only ones that can verify this are Sega themselves. The timing sure was suspicious, though, that I talk about the nature of Halpha's borders, and now Vasco just shows up. If you don't know who I'm talking about, let me explain. This NPC Vasco basically has you running around the region, gathering and making observations. However, it's what they say that is the most intriguing. One of their largest assertions is that the borders around each region are being caused by the floating device in the sky. Now, do I necessarily believe this? Well, the idea has merit considering similar devices are located around it as well. I don't believe it's correct, and that's fine. The thing to keep in mind about the NPCs of Halpha is that they might not be right. As we'll see later today, the information they know can change over time. If anything, I liken that this guy is similar to myself, except he doesn't have the historical knowledge of the series that I have. If I didn't either, I might be thinking the same way he was here. But I'm sticking with my world ship idea. I still believe this is the way things are going, although if I could make a backup prediction if that turns out not to be right, I want to suggest something similar. Domed areas, but it's not a ship in space. Think the 1990s movie that all the critics hated, starring Pauly Shore and Stephen Baldwin, called Biodome. Again, given the structures in the ground, the volcano engine, the screens where Crawford is, and the way Kvaris suddenly froze over, I don't think Vasco is right, but I at least want to have a backup prediction, given how out of left field the initial one was. Then again, this could all be for entertainment, at which point we're talking something similar to The Truman Show, but despite some evidence we'll talk about later supporting even that, honestly, that's a stretch even for me. One last thing about theorizing and understanding lore before we move on. Vasco is in the same position I am, trying to understand the nature of Halpha. In the end, we simply want to know the truth. Learning the truth is more important than being the one that put the pieces together. I'll admit it's nice having a decent accuracy ratio to what I theorize about, but that's not why I do this. And you've seen in the past I'll clarify when I get something wrong, like when I was talking about the panels in Vanford. I'm constantly learning new things and throwing out old information when it's determined to no longer be valid. I recently learned I have to throw out the first part of the opening sequence to Phantasy Star The End of the Millennium because the global version doesn't match the Japanese opening correctly. Sorry for the long-winded speech here. This was just something I needed to get off my chest. As much as I would like to say something about Rayjord Gorge, we don't necessarily have all the pieces together yet here. However, it's still something that I at least want to address here, so let me at least state some facts on the region. We know Rayjord Gorge is basically the coldest region in Kvaris. One might think that the source for how Kvaris became a snow-filled region would be located right here with it being so cold, and yet for some reason, it isn't completely frozen over. If it was, we wouldn't be seeing all this water around. In addition, if we go inside the location where the ancient enemies are, we can tell that things are melting inside. There are very few places up high where our feet can actually find a foothold. In addition, the way the ancient enemy spawns is very distinct. It drops from the roof of the area as if it was being held in place for 100 years, and then suddenly it comes crashing to the ground like whatever was holding it melted. There is one possible explanation for why it can be so cold and warm at the same time, but it's so deep into the lore of the series that it probably warrants its own video at some point to explain it in full. Honestly, I'm not looking forward to putting that one together. I wasn't really even looking to dive into this topic for quite some time, and my original script omitted this information, as sometimes it's hard to even determine what happened when this thing comes into play. But after a test screening of this video, I've added it back in. Thank you, Rooks37, for pushing me on this. For now, let me give you a simplified version, as we're going to be diving into some very deep lore of the series. This is some midichlorian level bullcrap we're about to get into here, and if you want to skip this, please go ahead and go to this time code with the answer being photons. Now, as much as this is a meme in the community to just say photons, I'm not kidding. It's photons and the nature of how photons are able to be influenced to selectively target different things that explains what's going on here. Up until now, we haven't needed to talk about photon types. However, looking back into the series lore, there are several types of photons that exist. This is best represented by the physical appearance they take when in an inactive state, and are equally represented by different technique types. First for Okay, first, before we do this, just know that some techniques are actually intended to be based on German versions of these words, and were mangled in their translation from German to Japanese, and then Japanese to English. Sega has been reluctant to fix this error. Anyway, first for Foy or fire, you have band photons. For Zond or lightning, you have Zon photons. For Grants or light, you have Graf photons. For Megid or dark, you have megaphotons. For Zan or wind, they sit in an interesting state where we don't have an official name for them, but I suspect they'd be called Zan photons. And then for our purposes here today, for Barta or ice, you have ray photons. Each of these names, aside from Zan, comes to us from the Geralt sub-series. Each of these types in inactive states could be combined with other parts in that series to craft melee weapons that had elemental strength, with the exception of Zan, because instead of wind-based photons, players had access to Daiga, or earth-based photons called diphotons in Geralt. This isn't an exhaustive list of photon types. There are others such as A-photons. Now, because of the influence of ray photons in this area, the typical way arcs are able to regulate their temperature simply doesn't work here. This is exhibited quite distinctly in that if you don't come into the area with 100% resistance to the cold, you will not only take consistent damage, but from time to time, you will also be frozen within an ice cube. Now that the groundwork is set, in terms of the photon selectively choosing what to target again, we can see that, as mentioned before, with how portions of the area are melted. Photons can at times exhibit signs of awareness and even sentience. They can also be influenced and corrupted. As another example, let's think back to Episode 2 of Phantasy Star Online 2. There was a moment during that where Afim was trying to help his sister that eventually led to a situation where the player intentionally uses their weapon against the two of them. Rather than it killing both of them, it helped to cleanse the negatively influenced photons within Eklita, purifying her of her Dark Falls influence. Basically, there's no friendly fire with players in a party in these games, except during specified player versus player modes. In the case of what's happening in Rayjord Gorge, it's possible the photons in the area have been influenced to support the dolls, and to attack the arcs. That's why the area for the ancient dolls is melting. It's so the ancient dolls can be freed, and, as the message pack outside the cave explains, they slow their flow within the arcs. Now, I want to be clear, it's never directly stated in any of the games that this is something photons can do. It's more the way they act that makes this a possible explanation. Photons can be influenced and corrupted, but they can learn other traits as well, and yes, even become sentient, as in the case of photon beasts. Generally, the most effective thing against one type of photons are photons that are opposite. This is why almost every enemy in the game will have the element they are weak to under their name. This is a feature that has carried forward since the original Phantasy Star Online, taking different forms in each sub-series. In the case of Rayjord Gorge, we'd look to ban photons as the opposite of ray photons to cancel them out. Look, when this comes up as a topic, even I get confused sometimes on what's actually happening. And if I get confused, I hope you can understand why I was hesitant to even bring this up today. Unfortunately, the people of Halpha have no idea what I'm talking about here, and as such, we're stuck with this area as it is. Now again, this was the short version of the explanation, and while we don't have all the answers at this time, the fact the name of the photon type we're dealing with here, ray photons, is also a part of the name, Ray-Jord Gorge, is very telling of what likely has happened here. Lost Central is a very interesting place. We know almost nothing about it, except it's contained within that mountain. Something else odd is that despite what it is, the space is also very underutilized. Let's take a brief look around the area. If we start from this point, we can see a giant screen here, similar to what we see in the other regions. To the right are several buildings, each obviously broken and ruined. Some parts completely encased in ice. Further along, we have the 6 shops similar to those seen in Central City, and then Lost Central Tower is near those. Moving to the left of the screen, we have a couple of more ruined buildings, and then the only other thing in the area is the entrance to Lost Central. There's so much space left over for more buildings. It's odd for an area to be so large and not have buildings to fill it. So the question I have is, when Lost Central fell, was the place still in the process of being built up? So this covers what came up when Kvaris released. Since then, we've had 2 sets of mini-episodes as well, which have greatly helped to flesh out the lore, so let's cover some of that as well. During one of the side stories, we encounter Manon outside of Resolve Forest. During this, Manon tells us that while dolls are autonomous and able to act on their own, there also exist command dolls, which have the ability to override that autonomy and instruct dolls to take other actions. Basically, dolls are networked together. As I stated previously, I'm of the belief there is a mother entity in play on Halpha. Given that mother in the context of what we've known her as previous to Episode 4 of Phantasy Star Online 2, was a computer system able to command various machinery, and even the people in some cases, such as the casts in the AMF in Garal, this mother entity is likely the commanding unit of the command dolls. Whether we're going to call her Mother Brain or Mother Trinity or something else is yet to be seen, however. Though it wasn't an exact match, I'm still taking a W here. The characters have confirmed in those vats is dolls material. In addition, this area is in fact being used to generate power, which isn't too far off from what I said about the giant piston. We also learn that energy that's being generated down there supplies power to Retem City. The odd thing, though, is that we don't really see any connectors down there. Or do we? Look around. The infrastructure I've called out many times in the past is glowing, as if it's getting power. Given that we know the ground is filled with structures like these, it's not that hard to assume that Retem City could be sitting on top of one of these conduits getting energy. Now, I don't think the wires we see around Retem City are related. They seem to be more involved with the sound system Nadara uses for her concerts, rather than getting energy. During a prior Secrets episode, some of you may remember I pointed out this untextured building found within the recently announced Stia region. We now have intel from Ran, of all people, that gives us a hint about what that building is for. Apparently, it's where dolls are being built. That's right, dolls are not living beings, but are manufactured. Remember when I was talking about soft robotics earlier in this series? I'll hold off on taking my W until we're actually in there to see for ourselves. In addition, take a close look at what we're seeing here. An unnatural formation of teeth along these sections. If that doesn't spell artificial, I don't know what does. Just another point that lends credence to the idea I presented previously, that we're actually looking at an engine in that volcano. Also, one last note. It's interesting that Central City seems to have a direct line to the Stia region. It makes me wonder if Crawford could end up firing the central cannon at there, if we ever manage to remove these borders around the regions. But then again, if that's open space inside those borders, oh boy, we don't want to open those. Okay, so those were the major things we learned in the mini-episodes. Now there are some other topics I want to discuss today. So some of you may remember when I posted this clip online of a weird sound I was hearing. There was a strange pulsing sound that can be heard if you turn your music off and the sound effects way up. Here, have a listen. The sound is the same in each region, and I never noticed this during our time in Retem. When I first heard this sound, and had no idea what it was, I turned to the community, and they've come up with an interesting answer, which makes it seem more like a glitch in the game than anything else. From what I can tell, it seems to be correct. Generally, this was determined to be caused by the region mags dancing around on their platform. For some reason, when you move away from them, the volume no longer goes down to 0%, but instead will stay slightly up from 0. The range of influence for this is also massive, so right here, we can hear the sound. Take a few steps, and we no longer hear it. Now let's open the map. See where I am? Now take a look at how far away the region mags are. I have no idea why Sega decided to make the sound effect go out so far. I can only assume this was a mistake and hope it gets fixed. So it's pretty obvious by now that Manon is working for an outside group, but I need to call attention that Manon might not be the only one on Halpha observing things. Have you ever taken a good look around the arena of the purple triggers? Look up here. There's an observation deck here. Someone could easily be watching the combatants down below. Who could be doing this, and how are they getting inside the Trania is still a mystery. Maybe there's a back door we haven't found yet. Located at this point in Retem, a strange occurrence with the sound effects can be heard here. Special thanks to Arwen for pointing this out to me. I have never heard this track at any point that I can recall. The fact that it's just a short loop means there's barely anything we can make of it. Why does this short track exist and play when you're gliding down in the sand like this? For those of you that don't know, Polaris was the name of the Idola both Uli and the main character could use in Idola Phantasy Star Saga. However, on Halpha, this symbol also exists, specifically on the clothes both Goror and Aina wear. This potentially goes to the idea that Aquilo, an important Arcs figure on Vandor, may have originally come from Halpha, but we really can't say that for certain yet. This is just something to keep in the back of the mind for now. So that's what I've got for today. Steel releases December 7th. I can't wait to get in there and see what's going on, and if that will be the end of Episode 1 as we know it. If you've enjoyed today's content, go ahead and get subscribed. I primarily focus on the content of the Phantasy Star series, but from time to time, I do go outside of it as well. And with that, thank you for joining me today. This is PrinceBrightstar signing off. I'll catch you next time. Okay, so last time I did this, I led you on about a glitch with the DLS system. Let's just consider if I do these in the future, that I might be right, I might be wrong, but it's being presented in an intentionally funny way. Anyway, there's a topic I need to address from last time that I didn't get to. During that same scene where Manon almost outs herself, there's a brief moment when the camera focuses on her clothes. It's here that we can see several lines of characters on her left arm and right hand. As it turns out, the symbols shown there are of the same type seen in Rizal Forest. The main issue with reading them, aside from the fact at this point we still don't have any kind of Rosetta Stone to translate, is the small resolution of the characters. Some have speculated they're Japanese characters, but they're only 3 pixels tall. This makes it incredibly hard to be able to tell what the characters are supposed to be. But what if I told you one of these was a symbol rather than letters? Now, why would a symbol be important? Well, it's simple. I know who Manon works for. And it's one of the most unlikely alliances ever because it implies a massive crossover with Square Enix. Those of you that played the Japanese version of Phantasy Star Online 2 will recall several years back, a boss known as Odin made their way from Final Fantasy XIV to Phantasy Star Online 2. However, in this case, The crossover is with Square Enix's Taito division. That's right, I'm talking about those buggers. The group Manon works for are Space Invaders.